The universe remembered General Sorelia Voss for the lives she refused to spare, but Mason Reed would remember her for the first breath she did not know how to ask for. The oxygen alarm sounded like a dying clock inside the detention vault of Mournfall Station. One sharp pulse every 3 seconds, red light washing over the curved walls, the cracked floor, the frozen mist curling from broken vents. Lieutenant Mason Reed opened his eyes to darkness, then to red, then to the pale blue numbers blinking on the inside of his helmet. Oxygen reserve, 7 minutes. His chest tightened before fear could find a name. The air in his suit tasted metallic, thin, recycled too many times through a filter that had already given more than it owed. Somewhere above him, a support beam groaned. Somewhere beyond the door, the station's outer hull complained against the vacuum with a low, whale-like sound. Mason moved one hand, then the other. His gloves scraped across powdered glass. His ribs ached from the impact, but nothing felt broken enough to stop him, and that meant he was still responsible for staying alive. He rolled onto his side and saw the others first as shadows, then as still shapes under emergency blankets, their helmet lights dark, their suit beacons silent. His squad had been alive 30 minutes ago. 12 prisoners in a holding bay. 12 tired human voices trying to sound brave, while an alien officer with silver-blue skin and eyes like cold stars stood beyond the force glass and gave an order without raising her voice. No prisoners. Mason remembered the words with cruel clarity. Not shouted. Not angry. Just clean, formal, practiced. Like closing a file. He pushed himself upright and swallowed the dry burn in his throat. The vault had been hit moments later, not by rescue, not by mercy, but by some failure deep in the station's spine. A power surge. A pressure rupture. A piece of war machinery deciding, with perfect indifference, that everyone inside was equally fragile. He looked toward the far side of the chamber, where the command observation booth had collapsed into a cage of bent alloy and fractured glass. At first he thought the figure inside was a reflection. Then she moved. General Sorelia Voss lay half-buried beneath a tilted panel, her armor split along one shoulder, silver blue plating blinking with damage codes. Her skin, where the emergency lights touched it, shimmered faintly like moonlit steel underwater. Her hair, cut at her shoulders, floated in the weak static field around her helmet seal, pale and weightless. One side of her face mask was cracked. Every breath she took made a soft, broken hiss. Mason stopped breathing for 1 second too long. The Silver Butcher of Veyrathi Command. The general who never spared captured soldiers. The woman whose name had traveled through Terran briefings like a warning label. She saw him. Even trapped, even bleeding oxygen into the ruined booth, her gaze found his with the precision of a weapon-locking target. Her eyes glowed ice blue through the cracked visor. Mason reached for the sidearm at his hip, more from memory than intent. The weapon was still there. Cold. Heavy. Pointless, maybe. His suit timer clicked down to 6 minutes and 42 seconds. Sorelia's lips moved behind the damaged mask. His translator crackled, caught half the phrase, then rendered it in a voice too calm for the room around them. Finish it, human. Mason stared at her. The alarm kept beating. Red light. 3 seconds. Red light. 3 seconds. He could leave her there. He could take the emergency mask clipped to the wall behind him, patch his own suit, and maybe reach the service tunnel before the next decompression wave. He could let the universe balance one small line in a war that had never cared about fairness. His hand closed around the grip. Then his eyes shifted past her, to the control board just beyond her pinned arm. A row of green lights still glowed there. Life pods. Not his. Not Terran. Veyrathi pods on the lower deck, probably full of her soldiers, sealed behind a safety lock only her command code could open. Sorelia saw him notice. For the first time, something flickered across her face that was not command and not contempt. Not fear for herself. Urgency. Mason's breathing turned rough inside his helmet. He thought of his father in a garage outside Boise, fixing old engines and saying a man's character was what he did when anger gave him permission to do worse. He thought of the 12 silent beacons behind him. He thought of the word no, and how easily it could become a home if you lived inside it too long. His oxygen dropped to 6 minutes. The emergency mask was 10 feet away. Sorelia's broken hiss grew softer. Mason released the weapon. It hit the floor with a dull magnetic clack. The general's eyes narrowed, confused now, almost offended by the absence of hate. Mason limped to the wall, pulled the mask from its bracket, and checked the connector with shaking fingers. Standard crossfeed valve. Old design. Terran compatible if he forced the seal. Varathi compatible if he broke 2 safety tabs and ignored every warning label printed on the hose. He gave a short, breathless laugh that hurt his ribs. Of course, he whispered. One mask. He looked through the cracked glass at the alien general who had ordered men like him erased from the war. Then he looked at the control board only she could reach. The alarm pulsed again. Mason stepped toward her, carrying his last chance at air in both hands. Mason reached the cracked observation booth with the mask hose dragging behind him like a lifeline that did not know which body it belonged to. The glass between them had not fully shattered. It bowed outward in a spiderweb of stress fractures, holding back just enough atmosphere to keep the booth from becoming a coffin, but not enough to save her. Frost grew along the edges of the break in delicate white veins. Every few seconds, another thread of air slipped through with a thin whistle. Sorelia watched him approach without blinking. Even trapped beneath the fallen panel, she carried herself like a throne had simply collapsed around her, and she refused to acknowledge the inconvenience. "Do not touch my systems," she said through the translator, her voice broken by static. Mason knelt beside the fracture and pulled a compact tool from his thigh pouch. "You are welcome. I did not thank you." I noticed. His hands moved on habit because habit was safer than thinking. He snapped the first safety tab off the mask connector, then the second. A warning light blinked amber on the valve. Unsafe crossfeed. Atmospheric mix unknown. Mason ignored it and used the edge of his multi-tool to shave down the seal. His fingers felt thick inside the gloves. The oxygen timer in his helmet ticked under 5 minutes and 30 seconds. Sorelia's gaze flicked to the number reflected faintly in his visor. She understood digits. Every species that went to space learned to worship countdowns. Your supply is failing. Yes. Then leave. Mason kept working. The small plastic tab finally broke free and spun away across the floor. That is your advice? It is strategy. No, he said, pressing the altered valve into the emergency mask. It is arithmetic pretending to be wisdom. For the first time, her expression shifted. Not softness. Something sharper. Curiosity with teeth. You insult a general while kneeling in front of one. I am kneeling because the hose is short. He pulled a strip of pressure tape from his kit and wrapped the connector until the leak reduced to a faint flutter. His breath fogged the inside of his helmet for a moment before the scrubbers cleared it. He could feel the suit working harder now, pushing stale air through tired filters. His pulse sounded loud in his ears. Sorelia tried to move her pinned arm toward the command board. The panel over her shoulder dragged against the floor with a low metallic scrape. She stopped, jaw tight, the hiss from her cracked mask growing uneven. Mason looked past her at the controls. The life pod indicators still glowed green. 8 pods, maybe 9. He could not tell through the fractured glass. "Those are your people down there," he said. Sorelia did not answer. "Can you open them?" Her eyes remained on him. "With my command code. Can you reach the panel?" Silence. That was answer enough. Mason fed the hose through a jagged opening in the glass. The edge caught the rubber line. He reached farther, shoulder pressing against the fracture, and carefully worked it through inch by inch. A sliver of glass scratched across his glove. The outer layer sealed itself with a quiet chemical pop. Sorelia stared at the hose as if it were a weapon more dangerous than anything he had dropped. "Human," she said, lower now. "If you give that to me, you reduce your survival window." I passed basic math. "Then you know this is irrational." Mason gave the hose one final push. The mask landed within reach of her free hand. I was a rescue technician before the war. Irrational is half the job. She did not take it. Her fingers hovered above the mask, long and trembling slightly, silver blue skin reflecting the pulse of the alarm. Pride held her still longer than fear had any right to. Mason looked at the timer again. For minutes and 48 seconds. "General," he said, and his voice lost the dry edge. "There are people in those pods who still have air because you can open that board. So take the mask." Her glowing eyes lifted to his. "I ordered the death of your prisoners." The words entered the vault and stayed there. Mason felt them settle behind his ribs. He turned his head, just enough to see the dark beacons of his squad behind him, then looked back at her. I know. And still you would preserve my life. No, Mason said. His throat tightened. I am preserving theirs. You are just the door I have to open. Something in that answer reached her more cleanly than mercy would have. Ceralia's hand closed around the mask. She brought it to the cracked seal of her helmet and pressed it in place. Mason opened the valve. His own oxygen warning dropped from amber to red. The first breath entered her system with a soft rush. Her shoulders lifted, then steadied. She did not gasp. She controlled herself even then, drawing in air slowly, carefully, as if each breath was now a borrowed object she was afraid to break. Mason braced one hand against the glass and watched the life return to her eyes by fractions. The alarm kept pulsing. The hose trembled between them. On one side, a human with less air than hope. On the other, a general who had never been taught what hope cost. Ceralia took 3 breaths before she moved. Not fast, not desperately. 3 measured draws through the borrowed mask, each one shallow enough to leave Mason a few more seconds on the other end of the hose. He noticed that. He hated that he noticed. The general who had once spoken about human prisoners like numbers on a tactical display was counting his breaths now, rationing them, as if they belonged to a child asleep in the next room. Her free hand pressed against the floor. The panel pinning her shoulder shifted with a strained metallic groan, but it did not rise. Her jaw tightened. A flicker of pain crossed her face and vanished so quickly most people would have missed it. Mason did not. Rescue work taught a man to read the small betrayals of the body. A stiff wrist. A held breath. Eyes focused too hard on nothing. Stop pushing against it, he said. You are making the frame flex. Ceralia's eyes cut toward him. I require access to the board. You require a functioning arm. The pods require my command. Mason looked down at his tool pouch, then at the cracked glass, then at the beam angled above her like a locked gate. His oxygen warning chimed again, softer now, almost apologetic. 3 minutes and 59 seconds. He had spent years crawling through collapsed mining tunnels on Titan, listening for trapped workers behind walls of ice and steel. He knew the math of impossible spaces. He knew when a door could not be opened and had to be persuaded. Can you rotate your wrist? He asked. Barely. Can you see the manual release beneath the left side of the console? Her gaze shifted past the cracked visor. Yes. Good. I am going to tell you what to press. Ceralia stared at him as if the sentence itself had violated military protocol. You know Verathi command architecture? I know panic design. Mason leaned closer to the fractured glass and squinted through the red flicker. The board was alien, but fear made engineers honest. Emergency systems always had shape language. Protected switches, recessed toggles, color codes designed for shaking hands in bad light. He tapped the glass near the lower left quadrant. That recessed crescent, is it blue or green? Blue. Ignore it. That is probably atmosphere cycling. The 2 vertical keys above it, are they lit? One is. Press the dark one first, then the lit one, then hold your palm to the center plate. Ceralia looked back at him. If you are wrong, I may seal the pods permanently. Mason swallowed against the dryness in his throat. Then let us be lucky. A low vibration moved through the floor beneath them. Somewhere deep in Mournfall Station, a generator coughed back to life, then failed again. The lights dimmed to a bruised purple before returning red. Mason felt his knees weaken. He locked them out of spite. Ceralia extended her hand toward the controls. The movement was only a few inches, but each inch cost her. The borrowed hose stretched between them. Mason held it steady with both hands so the cracked connector would not tear loose. Her fingertips reached the first key. Pressed. A tone answered. She pressed the second. Another tone. Lower. Older. The center plate opened like an eye. Now, Mason said. Palm down. It will identify my rank. That is the idea. It will also record that I am alive with a human prisoner. He understood then why she had hesitated. The board was not only a lock. It was a witness. It would tell her fleet everything. The silver butcher trapped in her own prison vault, breathing through a human emergency mask, taking instructions from the last man she should have allowed to live. Mason's voice came out rough, but steady. General, your people in those pods do not care how history looks right now. Ceralia held his gaze for one long second. Then she placed her palm on the plate. Blue-white light climbed over her fingers, reading skin, pulse, command authority. The console answered in her language, too fast for the translator, but the meaning arrived through the floor. Locks disengaged. One by one, green pod lights turned gold. Open, open, open. A faint sound carried up from the lower deck. Not voices, not yet, but machinery shifting from sealed silence into rescue. Sorelia closed her eyes for half a breath. Mason watched the change move through her face. It was not relief exactly. It was impact, like a person hearing, for the first time, that a law they had worshipped was smaller than a life it had almost cost. His timer hit 3 minutes and 9 seconds. The mask hose pulsed between them. Sorelia opened her eyes. "Your name?" she said. Mason blinked. "What? You have used my rank twice. I do not know what to call the man losing air for my soldiers." He almost laughed, but there was not enough oxygen for that. "Mason Reed." She repeated it carefully, as if names were fragile in her mouth. "Mason Reed." Then the station speakers cracked open with a new sound, an incoming transmission, Veyrathi military encryption, sharp and cold. Sorelia turned her head toward the broken ceiling. Mason saw the old command return to her posture before the words even translated. "General Voss," the speaker said, "remain where you are. Containment protocol has been authorized." The life pod lights below continued to glow gold. Mason looked at her. "Containment." Sorelia did not answer at first. For the first time since he had found her, the cold in her eyes was not aimed at him. "They are not coming to rescue us," she said quietly. "They are coming to erase the room." The word erase did not echo. It landed flat, like a tool placed on a metal table. Mason looked at the ceiling speaker, then at the life pod indicators glowing gold beyond Sorelia's shoulder. Somewhere below, her soldiers were waking inside sealed rescue capsules, unaware that their own fleet had already decided what their lives were worth. The station trembled again, this time in a steady rhythm. Docking clamps. A ship was attaching to the outer ring. Mason had heard that sound before from the wrong side of a rescue hatch. It meant help was close enough to touch, and still might not be help at all. His oxygen timer dropped below 2 minutes and 40 seconds. The numbers were red now, pulsing in the corner of his vision with each beat of his heart. Sorelia's borrowed mask rose and fell slowly against her face. Too slowly. She was rationing his air harder than he was. "Do not do that," Mason said. His voice came out thin. "Do what?" "Pretend you are not breathing. I am reducing consumption. You are suffocating politely." Her eyes narrowed, but there was no anger in it. Only calculation wearing a cracked uniform. The transmission returned, louder. "General Voss, command verification required. Confirm human asset contamination. Confirm preservation risk. Confirm containment." Mason stared through the broken glass. Human asset contamination? Sorelia's fingers curled against the console edge. Their language for dishonor. Being helped is dishonor. Being witnessed is. The answer made the room colder than the failing vents. Mason thought of every briefing that had painted the Veyrathi as merciless machines in beautiful armor. He had believed some of it. Maybe most of it. But machines did not hesitate before breathing borrowed air. Machines did not open pods for soldiers who would never know what it cost. Sorelia turned toward the console and lifted her hand again. The panel still trapped her shoulder. She could reach the board, but not enough of it. Not the secondary release. Not the structural override that might free her. Mason followed her eyes and understood. "Tell me where to cut. Your tools cannot sever Veyrathi load alloy. Then tell me where to annoy it until it gives up." A faint pause. If the room had not been dying, he might have called it amusement. She looked at the beam pinning her. There is a hinge node beneath the triangular brace. For inches below the white fracture mark. Mason shifted closer to the glass opening. "I cannot reach that from here." "No. Then we need to widen the break. That would depressurize the booth faster. The booth is already losing." She looked at his oxygen timer reflected in his visor. 2 minutes and 11 seconds. "So are you." Mason pulled the pressure tape from his kit and slapped 3 strips around the hose where it crossed the fractured glass. Then he took his multi-tool, reversed the grip, and struck the lower corner of the crack. Not hard enough to shatter the pane, just enough to teach it a new shape. The first hit rang through the vault. The second sent a thin line racing sideways. The third opened a gap wide enough for his arm. Air screamed through. Frost burst outward in a white plume. Sorelia's mask seal fluttered. Mason shoved his shoulder into the opening and reached through, the broken edge scraping against his suit plating. "Guide me," he said. "Left." Her voice was steady now because his was not. "Lower." "Stop." "There." His glove found the hinge node, a smooth raised circle under the brace. He pressed the multi-tool against it and activated the plasma tip on its lowest setting. The tool whined. Blue light spilled over Ceralia's armor, over her silver-blue skin, over the calm fury gathering in her eyes as the transmission repeated its demand. "Confirm containment." Ceralia reached for the command plate with her free hand. "No," she said. One word, quiet enough that Mason almost missed it under the tool's whine. The speaker clicked. "Repeat verification." Her palm pressed to the plate. "I said no." The console flashed. Across the lower deck, the gold life pod indicators turned green again, brighter this time. "Launch ready." Mason felt the hinge node soften beneath the plasma tip. The beam shifted 1 inch. Ceralia sucked in a breath before she could stop herself, and the hose pulsed. Mason's vision tunneled at the edges. 1 minute and 29 seconds. He braced his boots against the floor and pushed through the opening with everything left in his shaking arms. The beam lifted another inch. Ceralia slipped her pinned shoulder free, not gracefully, not like a legend, but like someone choosing life with no time left for pride. She collapsed forward against the console, caught herself, and entered a command code so fast her fingers blurred in the red light. Below them, the first life pod launched. A soft thump moved through the station. Then another. Then another. Not explosions. Departures. Small lives being thrown toward the dark with enough air to reach rescue. Mason let out a laugh that became a cough. His knees hit the floor. The hose sagged between them. Ceralia turned from the console and saw him folding in on himself. One hand still gripping the tool, the other still holding the line steady for her. The speaker crackled one final time. "General Voss, you are ordered to stand down." Ceralia removed the borrowed mask from her cracked helmet, held it for 1 second, then pushed it back through the opening toward Mason. "Breathe," she said. He looked at the mask, then at the emptying podboard, then at her face behind the broken glass. For the first time, the general was not giving an order to end a life. She was begging without knowing the shape of the word. Mason did not reach for the mask at first. His hand hovered over it, shaking inside the glove, while the last life pod light blinked green on the console behind Ceralia. One more thump rolled through the station frame. The final capsule launched into the dark. Somewhere beyond Mournfall, 9 Varathi soldiers were alive because a human had chosen not to count enemies the way the war had taught him to count them. Mason's vision narrowed until Ceralia became a silver-blue shape behind a ring of red alarm light. The mask lay between them, close enough to save him, far enough to feel like a question. "Take it," Ceralia said. Her voice had changed. Not softer exactly. Stripped, like command had been burned away and only the person underneath remained. Mason dragged the mask toward his helmet port. The connector fought him, twisted from the damage, the seal sticky with frost. He tried once. Failed. Tried again. The room tilted. His suit alarm became a long, continuous tone. Ceralia watched his hands fumble, and something like panic moved through her eyes before pride could bury it. She pushed herself from the console, crossed the broken booth in 2 uneven steps, and gripped the edge of the fractured glass. "Mason Reed," she said, sharp enough to pull him back from the dark. "Look at me." He lifted his eyes. "Turn the valve clockwise." Half turn, then pressed the blue latch. He obeyed because her voice knew how to be followed. The mask locked against his helmet with a dull click. Air rushed in, thin and bitter, but air all the same. Mason inhaled too fast. Pain flared through his chest. He coughed, then forced himself to breathe slower, the way miners did when rescue was still a mile away and fear wanted to spend oxygen like money. The world widened by inches. Red light. Cracked glass. Ceralia's hand braced against the frame. Her own mask remained damaged. She had given him back the better seal. "You need it too," he said. "I know. Then why did you give it back?" Ceralia looked toward the ceiling speaker, where the command channel hissed with waiting silence. "Because someone has to stop counting bodies." Mason stared at her. The words were his, but they did not sound the same in her mouth. They sounded heavier, newly learned, painfully carried. Before he could answer, the far bulkhead lit with white scanning beams. The Varathi boarding team had reached the outer corridor. Their tools touched the vault door from the other side, not with the frantic rhythm of rescuers, but with the clean sequence of soldiers obeying a quiet order. Seal. Verify. Remove witness. Mason pushed himself upright against the wall. How long before they open it? Sorelia tilted her head, listening to vibrations in the metal. 90 seconds. Are they here for you or me? Yes. He almost smiled. That is not comforting. It was not intended to be. She turned to the console. Her shoulder moved stiffly, but her fingers were steady now. She brought up a schematic of the detention vault, its lines flickering in pale blue over the cracked panel. One emergency route remained, a service crawlway leading to an old mining airlock, 20 yards beyond the far wall. The route was sealed manually from their side and pressure-locked from the station core. Mason followed the diagram and felt the old Titan part of his brain wake up despite exhaustion. That crawlway is not rated for 2 people. Correct. Of course it is not. It is rated for maintenance drones. Then it is rated for 1 stubborn human and 1 disgraced general. Sorelia glanced at him. For one brief second, the ruin around them made room for something almost human in her expression. Not humor. Not yet. The memory of it. She entered another command, and the floor panel near Mason's boots released with a sigh of trapped dust. A narrow hatch opened into darkness. Cold air rolled up from below, smelling of old lubricant and stone. The boarding tools at the door grew louder. Mason looked down into the crawlway, then back at the still shapes under emergency blankets behind him. His gaze lingered on them longer than survival allowed. Sorelia saw it and did not speak. Some silences had rank. Some had grief. Mason touched 2 fingers to his helmet in a small farewell, then lowered himself into the hatch. His boots found the ladder rungs. Sorelia moved to follow, but stopped at the console one last time. The speaker crackled. General Voss, stand by for recovery. She looked at the closed door, at the Empire waiting behind it, at the law she had carried like armor for years. Then she removed the command medallion from her chest plate. It glowed with a pale internal fire, the symbol of her authority, the thing thousands of soldiers had obeyed without seeing the woman beneath it. She placed it on the console and keyed a final order across the entire Varathi emergency band. Her voice filled the station, calm, clear, and impossible to mistake. All surviving units, hear me. From this moment forward, prisoners are to be protected. Aid is to be given where life remains. This is a general order. The boarding tools stopped. For 3 seconds, even the alarm seemed quieter. Mason looked up from the hatch. Sorelia met his eyes through the red light. Go, she said. Mason shook his head. Not without you. Her luminous eyes held his, and for the first time he understood that she had never been spared before either. Not by her enemies. Not by her people. Not by herself. Mason stayed on the ladder with one hand on the rung and one hand raised toward her, though the vault door had begun to glow around its seams. The boarding team was heating the locks from the other side. White light traced the outline like dawn trying to enter a room that did not deserve it. Sorelia looked once at the door, once at the command medallion resting on the console, then stepped toward the hatch. The motion cost her. Her damaged armor clicked with each breath. The cracked seal at her helmet whispered a warning she ignored. Mason climbed down 2 rungs to make space. Careful, he said. This shaft was built for machines. Then it will learn to carry people. She lowered herself into the crawlway with a precision that made suffering look disciplined. Her boots touched the narrow ladder below his. For one awkward second, they were too close in the shaft, armor against armor, the shared mask hose looped between them like a fragile agreement. Mason shifted sideways, pressed his back against the cold wall, and let her pass. The metal smelled of dust, old coolant, and stone. Far above, the vault door gave a heavy mechanical crack. Move, Sorelia said. I thought generals went first. Generals survive by knowing when to follow the person who knows the tunnel. Mason almost had enough breath to laugh. Almost. He descended into the dark, counting rungs because counting was better than thinking about the red oxygen warnings still flickering at the edge of his vision. 10, 20, 30. The shaft narrowed after the first turn, becoming a horizontal crawlway barely wide enough for his shoulders. He dropped flat and pulled himself forward on his elbows. Sorelia entered behind him without complaint. Her armor scraped softly against the walls, each sound too loud in the confined dark. The only light came from Mason's helmet, a weak white cone trembling over cables, frost, and maintenance labels written in a language that had not expected a human to read it. Above them, the vault door opened. Voices carried down through the shaft, distorted by distance. Veyrathi soldiers. Calm. Professional. Looking for a general they had already decided was inconvenient. Mason kept moving. The crawlway angled downward, then left. His training returned in fragments. Check airflow. Watch condensation. Trust older tunnels because newer ones lied prettier. He touched the wall and felt a faint vibration ahead. There is pressure movement, he whispered. How far to the mining airlock? 30 yards, Sorelia answered behind him. Perhaps less. Perhaps. I was not assigned to maintenance. That is tragic. You would have loved it. A pause came from behind him, then the faintest sound. Not a laugh, but the beginning of one, stopped at the border by pain and disbelief. It vanished quickly. Still, Mason heard it. The tunnel shook as a containment pulse rolled through the station. Dust fell over his visor. A warning flashed across his display, atmospheric instability. His hand slipped on the metal floor, but he caught himself. Behind him, Sorelia's breathing sharpened. Your mask seal is leaking again, he said. Continue. That is not a fix. It is an order. You resigned your authority when you crawled into a vent after me. I did not resign anything. Then use it to stay alive. She said nothing. The silence behind him grew too controlled. Mason stopped and twisted as much as the cramped tunnel allowed. Sorelia's eyes glowed faintly in the dark, but her head had dipped toward one shoulder. Her hand gripped the wall, silver-blue fingers pressed hard against the frost. She was breathing through the damaged side of her system, refusing to pull more from the shared line. Again, Sorelia, he said, using her name before he could decide if he had earned it. Her eyes lifted. The name changed something in the tunnel. Rank fell away for one breath. War fell away with it. There was only a tired human and an alien woman with moonlit skin, both wedged inside a forgotten maintenance path, while empires made decisions in clean rooms far above them. You have to breathe, Mason said. So do you. I am. You are lying badly. I am new to it. This time he did laugh, but it came out as a rough exhale. He reached back, found the hose between them, and adjusted the split valve so the flow balanced more evenly. Sorelia noticed. Of course she noticed. You reduced your share. I corrected a system error. You are the system error, Mason read. Been told that before. The tunnel ahead brightened faintly. Not red. Amber. A service light near the airlock. Mason crawled toward it. Faster now, elbows burning, knees striking cold metal. The air tasted worse with every foot, thick with old minerals and a stale chemical tang. At the end of the crawlway, a round hatch waited under a crust of frost. Manual crank. No power. No friendly automation. Just a wheel the size of a dinner plate and the old rule of survival. If something mattered, it would be heavy. Mason grabbed it and pulled. It did not move. He braced his boots against the wall and tried again. Pain flashed through his ribs. The wheel shifted 1 inch, then stuck. Sorelia reached over his shoulder from behind, her hand covering the opposite side of the wheel. Together they turned it. Human strength and Veyrathi discipline. Scarred glove and silver-blue fingers. The hatch groaned open into a small mining airlock coated in dust. Beyond its outer window, stars burned over the curve of Mournfall's gray rock. Mason crawled through and collapsed against the floor grid. Sorelia followed, sealing the hatch behind them just as distant voices entered the crawlway. They had seconds now. The airlock console flickered awake under her touch, but a warning appeared in harsh amber symbols. Mason did not need the translator. The outer door could launch one emergency tether pod. 1 seat. 1 full oxygen cycle. Sorelia read it. Then Mason read her face. No, he said. She looked toward the stars, then back at him. You saved my soldiers. Her voice was quiet. Let me save one human. The word no came out of Mason before thought, before gratitude, before the old survival instinct could betray him. It struck the little airlock and had nowhere to go. Sorelia stood by the emergency tether pod with one hand on the console and the other braced against the wall, her damaged armor glowing faintly under the amber warning light. Beyond the small window, Mournfall rolled in silence, all gray stone and thin dust beneath a field of hard white stars. The pod waited beside them, A narrow capsule built for one maintenance worker, one oxygen cycle, one desperate escape from a place that had stopped caring who deserved to live. Mason pushed himself up from the floor grid. His knees almost failed. He caught the edge of the console and glared at the pod like it had personally insulted him. We are not doing that. Sorelia looked at him with calm eyes. Too calm. You have a better solution? I usually do after I complain for a minute. We do not have a minute. The inner hatch behind them rattled. Voices moved in the crawlway on the other side. Closer now, clipped and disciplined. The Veyrothi boarding team had followed the path. Their scanners would read heat, movement, breath. Mason heard a tool touch the hatch lock. Not frantic. Methodical. They had all the patience of people who believed obedience made them clean. Sorelia turned back to the pod. It has one seat. I can see that. It has one oxygen line. I can see that too. Then listen, Mason Reed. You will take the pod. It will eject toward the mining beacon. Your suit can broadcast on Terran emergency bands once clear of the station interference. You will live. And you? Her silver-blue fingers moved across the console. I will delay them. Mason stared at her. The same general who once used the word prisoner like a door closing now stood between him and her own soldiers, offering herself as the lock. It made no sense. It made perfect sense. That was what frightened him. You are not buying my life with yours. I am returning a debt. That is not how mercy works. It is how war works. Then maybe war is the problem. The hatch rattled again. A thin line of white light appeared around its edge. Sorelia's eyes flicked to it, then back to him. You told me someone had to stop counting bodies. Yes. Then stop adding yours to mine. Mason opened his mouth, but the station shuddered before he could answer. The airlock lights blinked. The pod console flashed a new warning. External trajectory unstable. The little capsule was not just one seat. It was half broken. Of course it was. Mason leaned closer, reading the schematic through a haze of exhaustion. The launch rail had power, but the guidance thruster was misaligned. A single passenger might survive if the pod cleared the station spin. Might. The odds were ugly enough to look familiar. He touched the lower panel. Old mining hardware. Manual stabilization port. A tether crank mounted outside the capsule frame. His breath slowed. Not from calm. From an idea arriving with steel boots. The pod does not need one person, he said. Sorelia narrowed her eyes. The display disagrees. The display assumes the passenger stays inside. Explain. Mason pulled open a maintenance compartment beneath the pod seat. A coil of emergency tether rested inside, packed beside a folded external harness. Titan mining pods use the same design. One worker inside, one drone outside, if the rail jams. Except we do not have a drone. Sorelia understood too quickly. No, Mason smiled faintly. Now you are learning human words. You would ride outside the capsule? Not ride. Stabilize. That is a distinction made by a man with poor judgment. Also been told that before. The hatch seemed brightened. A command voice came through the metal. General Voss, step away from the human. This chamber is under fleet authority. Sorelia's face hardened, but she did not look away from Mason. Your plan exposes you to vacuum turbulence. Only for 7 seconds. 7 seconds can end a life. 7 seconds can save one too. He took the external harness and clipped it to his suit with hands that trembled from low oxygen and stubbornness. Sorelia reached out and caught his wrist. The grip was firm, not forceful. Her skin reflected the amber light like brushed silver beneath blue glass. I was trained to measure lives by usefulness, she said quietly. You are making that impossible. Mason looked at her hand on his wrist, then at her eyes. Good. For a moment, neither moved. The hatch behind them began to open. Sorelia released him and stepped into the pod, not because she accepted the plan, but because time had made the choice smaller than either of them wanted. Mason sealed the inner restraint across her armor, then connected the shared oxygen line through the pod's auxiliary port. He kept the external tether attached to his own suit. The system beeped once. Half approval, half warning. Sorelia looked through the pod glass as the canopy lowered between them. Mason. He paused. Yes. Her voice came through the pod speaker, quieter now under the hum of launch power. If we survive this, I will not return to what I was. The words settled deeper than any promise. Mason pressed his gloved palm to the canopy. She lifted her hand from inside and matched it through the glass. Human glove. Alien hand. One breath between them. The hatch behind him opened wide enough for white light to spill across the floor. Mason turned to the outer controls and pulled the manual launch lever. The airlock screamed, "Open to the stars." The airlock opened with a flash of white silence. Sound vanished first, not because the world became calm, but because vacuum took every scream before it could become one. Mason felt the launch rail kick beneath his boots, felt the tether snap tight across his harness, felt the little pod surge forward with Soralia sealed inside it like a silver-blue heartbeat behind glass. The stars spun. Mournfall Station fell away in broken angles and red warning lights, a wounded machine clinging to the gray curve of the asteroid. Mason had 7 seconds to keep the pod from tumbling. 7 seconds of cold pressure against his suit. 7 seconds of every alarm in his helmet turning into one continuous red prayer. He gripped the external stabilization bar with both hands and pulled his body flat against the pod's side. The misaligned thruster fired too hard to the left. The capsule twisted. Mason hit the manual vane release with his elbow, once, twice, then held it open as the tether dragged across his chest plate. The pod shuddered. Inside the canopy, Soralia looked at him through layers of glass and reflection, her luminous eyes wide for the first time with something that was not strategy. "Left vein," Mason said, though he did not know if the radio carried. "Hold steady." The pod answered with a grinding vibration. Its nose corrected by a few degrees. Not enough. The asteroid's shadow rolled across them, swallowing the red light from the station and replacing it with the cold shine of distant suns. Mason's suit temperature dropped fast. Frost crawled along his visor edges in thin white claws. His oxygen system stuttered. The auxiliary line feeding the pod pulsed against his hip, and he saw the pressure gauge fall toward the warning band. Soralia's voice burst through the channel, sharp with static. "Mason, detach. The pod has enough angle." "Not yet. Detach now." That sounded like an order. "It is." "Then you still have not learned much." A broken laugh, or maybe a breath, crossed the channel from her side. Then the pod lurched again as the launch rail lost contact. They were free of the station, but not stable. The mining beacon glowed ahead, a tiny amber point nearly 200 yards away, blinking through drifting dust and frozen debris. Mason reached for the crank beneath the pod frame. His fingers felt slow. The glove's servos lagged. He locked his boots into the external footholds and turned the crank with both hands. 1 rotation. 2. The tether reel tightened, shifting the pod's center of mass. The capsule stopped rolling. Stars steadied. The amber beacon moved from the edge of the window to the center. For 1 clean second, everything worked. Then the station transmitted on an open band. "Unauthorized launch detected. Return pod immediately." Soralia did not answer. The command repeated. "General Voss, you are ordered to surrender the human asset." Mason looked through the canopy. Soralia sat upright despite her damaged armor, one hand on the pod console, the other pressed against the inside glass where his palm had been moments before. The amber glow traced the silver lines of her face. She looked less like a legend now and more like a woman standing at the edge of her own life, deciding which parts of it had been lies. She opened a fleet channel. Her voice did not shake. "This is General Soralia Voss. The human has a name." Static filled the gap. Mason kept turning the crank, slower now. His arms trembled. Soralia continued, each word clear enough to travel across every receiver listening in the dark. "His name is Mason Reed. He preserved Verathi lives when Verathi command chose concealment. He gave oxygen when our law gave silence. Any unit that calls him an asset will answer to me." The channel went quiet. Not defeated. Stunned. The pod drifted closer to the beacon. 100 yards. 90. Mason's helmet display blurred. Low oxygen. Low heat. Low everything. He tried to turn the crank again, but his right hand slipped. The capsule tilted. Soralia saw it instantly. "Mason. Still here. Your heart rate is unstable. You tracking that now?" "Yes." "Creepy. Human humor is poorly timed. It is kind of our specialty." The beacon grew brighter. At 70 yards, its automated rescue field caught the pod and sent a soft blue net of energy across the capsule hull. Mason felt the drag change. The pod was safe. Soralia was safe. His tether, however, had locked outside the field angle. The system began reeling the capsule in without him. The line pulled hard at his harness. A warning flashed. External load detected. Release required. Mason looked at the manual release on his chest. If he hit it, the pod would enter the beacon cleanly. If he did not, the rescue field might reject them both. Sorelia read the warning through the pod glass. Her hand struck the console. Override it. Can you? No. Mason's breathing became shallow. The stars behind her looked impossibly still. He thought of the garage in Boise. His father's oil-stained hands. The quiet way good men did hard things without expecting statues. He looked at Sorelia and gave one small nod. Do not go back to who you were. Her face changed. Mason, do not release. He smiled, tired and almost peaceful. That sounded like a request. Then he hit the release. The release clicked so softly that Sorelia almost believed it had not happened. Then Mason drifted away from the pod, slow and weightless, his tether curling beside him like a cut thread. The rescue field caught the capsule and pulled it toward the mining beacon, but he remained outside its blue reach, turning gently against the black. For 1 second, Sorelia did not move. The old part of her, the trained part, saw the math and named it final. Distance, velocity, oxygen, probability. Then the new part, the part Mason Reed had awakened with a hose through broken glass and a breath he could not spare, refused the answer. Her hand slammed against the pod console. Beacon control, emergency, override. Extend retrieval field to external human life sign. The system answered in flat Varathi text. Authorization denied. Single passenger safety limit. Sorelia's eyes burned brighter. I am General Sorelia Voss. Authority revoked pending review. There it was. Her empire, efficient to the end, stripping rank faster than it could extend mercy. She looked through the canopy. Mason was smaller now, a white suit against the stars, one glove lifted as if he were apologizing for being difficult. Of course he was. Humans, she was beginning to understand, often became impossible at the exact moment surrender made the most sense. Sorelia removed the cracked command medallion from the emergency slot where she had used it to power the pod systems. Its inner light flickered weakly, the symbol of her career, her victories, her obedience, her fear, polished until it looked like honor. She pressed it against the console core. Manual sacrifice authorization, she said. The pod warned her twice. She ignored both warnings. The medallion melted into light, feeding every remaining reserve into the beacon channel. Outside, the blue rescue field expanded. Not enough. Sorelia unlatched her seat harness, braced both hands against the pod controls, and redirected life support power into external retrieval. The air inside her capsule thinned at once. Frost formed along the glass. Her breath turned silver. Mason Reed, she said over the open channel, forcing calm into every word. You will hold still. His voice came back faint, broken by static and exhaustion. That is a terrible rescue plan. It is not a plan. It is an order. Thought you lost command. She looked at the melting medallion, at the darkening console, at the Empire channel still listening in stunned silence. Not of myself. The rescue field reached him at 20 yards. It flickered once, failed, then caught the edge of his suit and pulled. Mason's body jerked toward the pod, slow at first, then faster as the beacon compensated. Sorelia held the override with both hands while warnings filled the cabin. Her oxygen fell. Her vision dimmed at the edges. Still she held it. The pod struck the beacon cradle with a hollow thud. Mason hit the outer net seconds later, hard enough to trigger the emergency foam around him, soft enough that his suit beacon kept blinking. Alive. The word appeared on Sorelia's display in Terran medical green. Alive. She stared at it until her knees gave out. When Mason woke, the world was white instead of red. Not the white of vacuum or alarms, but clean medical light behind a curved glass wall. His chest hurt. His throat felt sanded raw. A Terran oxygen mask rested over his face, and the steady beep beside him sounded less like a countdown and more like permission. Beyond the glass stood Sorelia Voss. No command armor, no medallion, no silver-blue war mantle. Just a simple recovery suit, her metallic blue skin pale under the infirmary lamps, her shoulder-length hair brushed back from eyes that no longer looked untouched by grief. 2 Terran guards stood nearby. 3 Varathi officers waited farther down the corridor, stiff with uncertainty. No one spoke. Sorelia lifted one hand and placed it over her heart, palm flat against her chest. Mason did not know the gesture, but every person in the room seemed to understand it. The Veyrathi officers lowered their eyes. One by one. Days later, the hearing was broadcast across both fleets. Sorelia stood before a military council without rank markings. On the table before her sat Mason's emergency oxygen mask, cracked at the rim, patched with pressure tape, ugly and small beneath the grand lights of the chamber. They asked why she had disobeyed containment. They asked why she protected a human prisoner. They asked why her final order had changed the treatment of captives across an active front. Sorelia listened to every question. Then she touched the mask with 2 fingers. "I spared no prisoners because I believed mercy weakened an army," she said. "Then a dying human gave me his last breath and expected nothing in return. He did not call it strategy. He did not call it peace. He called it normal." The chamber stayed silent. Not empty silence. Changed silence. Months later, on Mournfall, a small marker was placed beside the rebuilt mining beacon. It carried no flag. Only 2 names, one human and one Veyrathi, carved above a line simple enough for any species to translate. Where breath was shared, the war began to end. Mason stood beside Sorelia as the stars came out over the gray rock. Neither of them saluted. Neither of them needed to. The universe had seen armies hold territory, empires hold power, and generals hold fear like law. But on that day, it remembered a man who held out oxygen to his enemy, and a woman who finally learned that sparing a life was not weakness. It was the first true command.